Hello and welcome everyone. Um, Great to have lots of people joining. I'll just give it a moment as the number's still ticking up rapidly, and then we'll dive into things. Okay, we'll get going there. Thank you so much everyone for joining us today for this webinar about the Net Zero Terrace Streets project. As I'm sure a lot of you know, this has been a really exciting project that's pushing a lot of new ground around decarbonising homes that are kind of in that hard to decarbonise sector. So this is a bit of a progress update from all sorts of different directions. Just to introduce myself, my name is Peter Griffin, and I'm chairing today's session. I'm from Regen. We support all sorts of things to further the mission of decarbonising energy, and I specialise in heat and building. So this is a project we've been very interested in supporting through the Net Zero Living programme that gave the project some of its funding. Firstly, a bit of housekeeping. There will be a Q&A session at the end. The Q&A button is the way we'll be doing this. The chat is open too, but that's not where I'll be taking questions. So feel free to have discussions, introduce yourself there if you like. But the Q&A feature is where you'll want to put a question if you want it to be asked to the panel. There's instructions there, but hopefully it's quite simple. And here is our panel today. So myself chairing, as I've said, we'll have Kate Gill-Martin laying out the kind of overview of the project so far, and then Phil from Bureau Happold will be talking about the kind of techno-economic modelling behind the project, and looking at how the technical aspect has kind of come together. And then we'll be moving on to kind of the financial sides with Ainsley and Adam, the financing, the financial model, and the investment kind of view. And then we're going to come back to Kate at the end just to hear a bit of a kind of reflections on the project so far, and to kind of look to the future and see what this project is doing. A big part of the Net Zero Terrace Streets project, as we'll see, is building a model that's replicable and something that can really grow across the country and support decarbonising those hard to treat homes. So that's enough from me, and amazingly I've done that within the 5 minutes, even though we started a bit late. So I'm going to see that as success and go straight to you, Kate.
Great, thanks, Peter, and yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Kate Gill-Martin, and I wear various hats. My day job, I'm Chief Executive at British Hydropower Association, but here I'm representing Rossendale Valley Energy, a community benefit society that's been working on the Net Zero Terrace Street project for 4.5 years now. So yeah, really delighted to be able to give you some updates today. I'm not sure, can I drive the slides or, yes, I can, brilliant. Okay, great. So just to kind of go back to basics in terms of why we're looking at terrace streets in particular, there's about 6 million fairly small footprint terrace homes in the UK. Many of these are pre-1990s, lots of them built where I live up in the Northwest in the Industrial Revolution. And currently many of them are on gas. But to decarbonise, it's more of a problem. And actually, one of the easiest solutions and one of the counterfactuals we use is putting in electric boilers, which is cheap to obviously put in, but then leaves the householder with a much more expensive bill. So the solution that we're bringing forward is about a system where we can knock on every door and have the same solution. So it can be mixed tenure. It's for areas where there's going to be potentially lower income households and therefore potential have higher fuel poverty. And as you can see from the back alley here, actually there's not huge amounts of space for things like air source heat pumps. And often these houses potentially could be on a centralised heat network, but they might not be near a large heat demand, city centres or whatever. And actually the likelihood of that happening anytime soon is fairly remote in some of these communities. So next slide, how do I move that forward? Oh yeah, brilliant. Yeah. So why street by street? Why not individual properties? And I think it is about the complexity of doing an individual property and actually, single measures, and also the fit and forget nature that we're doing in terms of retrofit often. And actually, how can we do that as a as a place-based whole system approach, street by street. Next slide. So that's kind of what it looks like for an individual, huge amounts of complexity. And I always kind of say, as soon as you say to someone, now you need to get 3 quotes, then you've lost them. So we all live really busy lives, and decarbonising our homes is not always the priority. So this is about, next slide, looking at it as a community approach, where you're actually looking at a single delivery vehicle, a wrapper, and how you actually work with the community through that wrapper in a trusted, integrated way. Next slide, please. So what's our route to deployment? So over those kind of 4.5 years that we've been working on this project, we've kind of broken it down into a couple of different things, really. And the first thing is the 5 systems approach. So we really have to do everything as a whole system. So we're looking at the physical infrastructure, we're looking at how we create demand, we're looking at the virtual infrastructure, which is a smart system that needs to basically subsidize the price of power. And we need to think about the organizational governance and the digital spine that needs to run along everything that we're doing. And our whole kind of ethos for community-based project is to decarbonize homes. You have to look at our 3-legged stool. You need to be able to address the behavioral issues, the finance issues, and the technical issues. But if you want a really solid stool, then those struts need to have a coordinated, place-based, trust-assured methodology to really ensure that people are getting the service that they need. So everything that we're doing is then kind of packaged up into an 8-stage methodology, which is really our end-to-end process that enables deployment. And underpinning that 8-stage methodology are the range of tools that we've been developing and activities to enable other communities to continue the work that we're doing as well. But everything goes back to that stool. Are we basically ticking those boxes? Are we addressing behavioural, financial, technical? Is this place-based? And is it going to be trusted? Next slide. Great, so going to the 5 systems, really quickly run through these, because I think if you've been on webinars before, then you probably understand some of the systems we're trying to look at. So first of all, it's the physical infrastructure. What's that technical solution? So we're doing retrofit, fabric retrofit, not deep enough to bring the heat load of the house down to meet the heat pump, and putting in smart kits and smart systems where we can, solar, storage, etc. I think really importantly on this slide, though, it's also we've got to pick up the necessary repairs. It's about making the building envelope as efficient as it can be. Next slide. We're looking at shared ground loop. As we showed earlier, we've got space constraint. So this is really thinking about in-street heat, shared ground loop heat network infrastructure, and then a small shoebox heat pump within the home. Next slide. Thank you. The second system, if you think back to the that 5-system approach, is the demand creation. This is about the behavior. It's about getting buy-in. And it's about a place-based solution, but it's all about how we can enable and bring forward that kind of community agency and the legacy, not just to support this project, but future projects as well. So it's about building capacity, building capability within the community to deliver these projects, but also bring forward the jobs and skills and have that future-proofing ongoing support, not just for maintenance, but also for expansion. Next slide, please. And then the next system, well, actually I put 2 systems on here, is the virtual infrastructure and the digital spine. So these kind of are overlaid in some ways, but the smart system is, what's the future distribution system need to be? How do we make sure that people who are currently benefiting from things like Octopus Agile tariffs because they can afford the kit, how can we make sure those benefits are going to people in these homes by getting the kit into people's homes, but then aggregating that kit at a very local substation level. So optimizing and balancing at a smart local energy solution. So we are enabling people to make the best use of that generation, but also aggregate up and be able to get revenue from things like aggregated flexibility. And that has to be overlaid onto our data or digital spine. And we're basically collecting data from people right at the get-go, who lives in a house, how many people, what is that property, what's the building energy model of that property, what's going to be the retrofit design, and that kind of flows through onto our techno-economic model, financial model, And then the point where we get to home energy management systems and really that kind of data aggregation for smart systems and a local digital twin of the area. Next slide, please. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's all about that kind of local governance, which is all about delivering locally, but also supported nationally. And I think what I want to draw your attention to here is the Energy Club. So every householder that wants to sign up to the to become part of the Net Zero Terrace Street project can also become a member of the Energy Club, and that has democratic oversight over both the physical infrastructure delivered by an asset co through a golden share, but also oversight of the smart local energy system as well. So this is really grounded in community governance. Next slide, please. And that's how we're kind of looking at national support. So Looped is the entity which is taking forward the Net Zero Terrace Street project to share that learning with local community organisations to set up that governance at their local level and support and enable them to deliver Net Zero Terrace Street. Next slide, please. And I think this is my final slide before I just show you some pictures of what we've been doing. But how do you deliver all this? So we've developed an 8-stage methodology which helps us deliver those 5 systems concurrently and ensures we get buy-in, ensures we've got the right governance there, ensures we've got an investable business model, ensures that we have the quality assurance across the project, and really gives that kind of consumer confidence, customer confidence, but also make sure we're bringing in supply chain and jobs and skills. So that's the 8-stage methodology that we've been delivering or working towards in the project that we're undertaking at the moment. Next slide, please. And we've been doing that in different ways, but one of the ways we've been testing that is by deployment of three demonstrator homes in Rossendale. And these are the 3 properties that we've been working on, 2 mid-terraces and 1 end terrace, very typical homes in Rossendale. And I'll just whiz through some pictures to show you the work that we've been doing. Next slide, please. So getting the site ready, obviously we're doing boreholes, so we have to make sure that we've got specific permits to work in the street, etc. And here we had to actually cordon off a car park. Next slide, please. We actually had to repair, we actually had to re-roof the houses, and this picks up on the point earlier about, a lot of homes will need repair works if we want to get a building fabric that's as energy efficient as it can be. So this is the repair work that went on before we put the solar panels on. And then the boreholes going in, you can see the drill rig, actually it's not a huge drill rig, so it can get down those narrow terrace streets. Next slide, please. And obviously then there's the trenching that needs to be done between the boreholes and the home itself, just as you would with putting in gas, etc. Next slide, please. And there's a picture of the heat pump next to the washing machine. It's called a shoebox. It's bigger than that, obviously, but it's not huge, so it can fit in next to the washer there. Next slide, please. And obviously doing the internal retrofit as well, so room and roof and internal fabric going in there in terms of kingspan, and a lot of air tightness measures going as well. Next slide, please. And I think key to it all is doing the monitoring and testing the work that we've done. So we did testing before we started doing the measures, and now this winter we're going to be doing testing post measures. So we'll also go back and do in February and do blower door tests and thermography to see how the buildings performed over winter as well. And I think I'm passing over to Phil next. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Kate. Sorry, I lost my cursor there for a second. So yes, just going to spend a few minutes talking about the techno-economic model and the approach to that, and how we're developing it, and how we're using that model to deal with some of the complexity around this. Because initially, I think when we've talked to people, they've said, well, surely this is relatively straightforward to cost. You put some kit in, you put the retrofit in, you have those costs, you work it through a model, and then you see how it pays. But as Kate sort of touched on, already, there is actually a process behind this that's being developed as well. That process includes how to actually engage in the first instance with a community. It includes how to onboard a local development vehicle, how to go through the different stages that were put up on that slightly different diagram before, but around undertaking a viability, a feasibility approach to determining where to go and what work's required, how to engage with consumers, and ultimately then what the design of the system is, how you deploy it, and what the cost of operating it is. So there are two aspects to how to appraise that. One is the techno-economic model and one is the financial model, and they work in harmony, but they're there to do two slightly different things. Ainsley will come up after me and talk about the financial modeling approach, which really is aimed, I guess, in summary, at how the overall operational system with the different organizations involved comes together and the flows of cash and finance to make this all work. The techno-economic model is ultimately boils down to the toolkit that the local development vehicle would use to appraise the viability of a cluster. And what we mean by a cluster is effectively whatever that scheme boundary is that we would like to deploy in a particular area. So that could be, for example, 200 homes or 1,000 homes connected through the ambient loop scheme. And then with the retrofit deployed and the smart local energy system deployed, and we would call that a cluster. And then within that cluster, we would phase delivery. So we might not expect to do 1,000 homes in one go. We might expect to phase it. And that would really depend on some technical items around the ability to work with those streets, grid capacity, constraints, street works, etc. But also, of course, the uptake and acquisition of consumers to participate in this. So these stages each effectively have a cost associated with them, and that cost could be initially around overheads and labour and time in terms of developing the initial feasibility studies and doing the consumer engagement and building that picture up. But eventually it moves into procurement, it moves into delivery and mobilisation, and then ultimately into operation and support. So all of those costs and those phases have to be considered, and recognising that revenue and a return only happens once the system's actually in. And that is done, which we'll talk about in a minute, around through a standing charge mechanism for recovery. So the first three phases are at risk in terms until you get security and you get acquisition from consumers. Now, the other thing that we want to sort of just to focus on here is that there is the model that prices up and works out an individual cluster. But of course, our ambition is to deliver multiple clusters and to roll this out. And there are economies of scale associated with that. So we need to find a mechanism to reflect on those economies of scale, bring them into the model. And also through the financial model that Ainsley will talk about, how you could flow that money cycle through from existing clusters into new clusters, so that you're not costing up and evaluating each cluster just in isolation, because there are economies also in the delivery vehicles and the organizations managing it. A simple example would be, for example, setting up a 24/7 line to support a cluster through warranty and faults. The cost of applying that to one cluster is very different than the cluster applying it to, say, 5 clusters, because you might still need only one call center contract, and there might only be a slight increase in cost to cover multiple clusters, and the same with an organization that's overseeing and managing the operation and management of that. So we want to bring those economies of scale in. We want to understand risk, and we want to be able to phase in the costs and understand the cost of deployment through these different phases as well. And we base the TEM over a 40-year period typically, although we can adjust that. And one of the reasons for doing that in the financial model is that we can attach the retrofit costs and other costs of the system to the heat infrastructure through debt. So What that allows us to do is then to factor in payment from households under the standing charge for over a much longer period than they otherwise would, and that standing charge then ultimately covers the price of the system. Within that, there are other layers as well, which will just show up on a diagram in a bit around renewable energy and community energy being brought into that mix through the smart system to reduce the bill as well. Next slide, please. So one of the aspects to just talk about as well is that we're helping to build is the planning flow. Now, what the planning flow does is identify where those clusters are, where the terrace streets are, but also then starts to map through what a cluster would look like, which homes would be connected to an ambient loop, what the level of retrofit would be needed, and what the rooftop orientation would be, and therefore how much PV you could put on, and what the generation profile of that PV would be, and how that would contribute to the bills as well. And we can use this spatial planning approach directly integrated into the techno-economic model, so that as we evolve the planning process, we're refining the costs, the size of the community that we're dealing with, the nature of the cluster, and we're putting that through the TEM. And that really then starts to boil down to, well, what archetypes have we got? Is there substation capacity? Would there be a flexibility payment or not? How long is the ambient loop? What length of pipe work would there be? What street works are required? Where would the boreholes be? Etc., etc. And then we can overlay demographic information onto this as well, so we can understand affordability criteria, whether this is an able to pay area or whether it's a fuel poverty area, etc. So all of that contributes to the techno-economic model that we would then apply. And as we go through the maturity of this, we would naturally start with benchmark and open data in many respects. Although as we develop and mature, we'll collect data from other clusters that would inform this process. But then as we start to refine, we'll start to actually engage the community. And through the Fairer Warmth app, the Centre for Energy Equality have developed, we can collect local community data, including household data, affordability data, what they've actually done on their homes, how much they pay on their bills, etc. And this all informs the affordability criteria and the building information that we use in the model and then ultimately all that feeds into the techno-economic model. Next slide. So breaking that down just in a diagrammatic form, you can see, and I won't go into the detail on this, but each of these components that are going through the planning flow that are feeding the TEM, the network aspects, the PV, the buildings, the cluster size, the funding options, the cost of finance, the boundary, social demographic information, all that's coming together to build a picture that ultimately then we use to evaluate the cost of that system and the payback likelihood, the affordability criteria, and if any grant funding is needed or any subsidy to support it as well. Next slide. And when we then condense this down into a refined model, we've come up with this as a very sort of simplistic way of looking at it, but this is really trying to explain what the bill would look like ultimately as well. So the standing charge covers the capital items predominantly, so it covers the heat infrastructure, covers the retrofit, covers the boreholes and the ambient loop, and it covers the in-home controls aspect of the smart local energy system. And that's then calculated over a 40-year period. We consider OPEX, REPEX and CAPEX, and we're still running through options around this model at the moment. For example, what we do with REPEX, because a traditional ESCO model would build REPEX in from the start for, say, a heat network, so that it can cover the cost of replacement of items later on. But from a social perspective, in this model, we want to take a look at that very carefully, because another way of interpreting that is that consumers would be asked to put money into a pot that wouldn't actually be accessed then for 10, 15 to 20 years to replace that equipment. And is it socially and ethical right to apply that to a bill in this context? So we're looking at refining the model and pulling out aspects like that, and looking at alternative ways to manage operational and maintenance costs, and consider that not just in isolation in the cluster, but consider it across multiple clusters and nationally. And then we have added to the bill as well the energy price itself. So this is the PV that's blended in from a community perspective, as well as access to wholesale energy or other options. So we blend the tariff in, and some of it we have less control on around what's coming in from the market, but some of it we have full control on. So for example, with the solar PV, because the standing charges covered the panels, we can charge whatever we wanted it, and in some cases might charge nothing at all for the PV generation on those roofs to contribute to the bill, as an example. So, and the next slide is just to round off that simple model becomes a more complex flow, and this is still a simplistic way of looking at it, but we build the model around this flow so that we understand all of the contribution costs to the standing charge. And actually, when you look at it in reality, there's a full long list of costs, everything from every single individual component. Every single capital item is captured, every single operational item, and the financial model informs the techno-economic model and what proportion of overheads should be applied to that particular cluster from the overall organizational structure. So it takes that into account, and then it starts to calculate, based on an average energy consumption for those buildings, what a bill would look like. And then that allows us to check the affordability criteria for each of those households in turn. I think that wraps up. I think that's my last slide, and I could take questions later on that, but I think this segues now quite nicely into Ainsley's presentation on the financial model.
Yes, Phil. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I've got a few slides just to run through the approach on the financial model and some sort of high-level insights. Apologies in advance for anyone who was looking for some hard numbers. We're not quite there yet, although very close on that before we share those. And then Adam will also just talk a bit around some of the more investment-rated considerations. Okay, so the financial model then. So it sort of links together the sort of three key parts, which is the technical model, which Phil's obviously just talked about. That's the sort of the source of truth, like the inputs that goes into the financial model. It links in the governance and the corporate framework, which Kate has mentioned there, around the different entities, all putting that together, and also thinking around what investors need to see and how that all flows together. It's a sort of template foundational model. There's a lot of variables within all this, but this acts as one template that can be used across all the different specifics of the project and how it all differs between different areas. As Phil's mentioned, it sort of focuses more around the individual entities within this group structure. So whereas the TEM has looks at the whole scheme and all the cost and revenues across it, the financial model then sort of takes those inputs and splits it between the entities and builds out individual cash flows and obviously overlays in the financing assumptions, adds in things like the tax and the reserves, builds in sensitivity analysis and other bits and pieces like IRRs and debt service cover ratios that investors will need. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if you sort of look back at the sort of the phases that Kate mentioned, sort of early on is the feasibility, and that's where the sort of the TEM is built up by the local development vehicle, understanding all different regional assumptions that need to go into it, and that will give sort of a high level go no go type decision based on some sort of high level analysis around the IRR and standing charge affordability. So once we got that, then the financial model is then built out. And that's basically looking at, as you overlay the financing assumptions, the sort of the three key questions, which is obviously, is standing charge affordable? But then based on that, what is the operational cash flows that are generated by the project and at each individual entity level? And can they service the financing and the debt within each of those phases, which then obviously determines the debt capacity levels, which then determines what level of grant is required to make the whole thing work. And obviously with the grant stuff, what we're kind of seeing is it reducing over time as the project benefits from the economies of scale and the efficiencies. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the methodology, so first one, I suppose, it's built on first principles data. That basically just so the technical model is a source of truth. That is a sort of live data that comes from building up all the inputs as accurately as possible from all the projects that's been done, and building off all the different local development vehicles work, So it's not sort of generic assumptions we're putting into this financial model. It's structured to test scenarios dynamically. So basically that just means that there are a lot of different variables within this, and there's a lot of different ways to make this work in terms of the standing charge, the grant funding, the different financing that might be available depending on different regions. So trying to be as dynamic as possible around the outputs of what this financial model is. At the moment, we're working on so firstly how the project is phased. So if you look at a local development vehicle overall scheme, how does that build up across different phasings? 200 homes going to 1,000, going to 3,000, etc. Looking at over time how that capex then will expect it to reduce with the learning curves on that, the different opex and the repex, the replacement expenditure options that we have that obviously Phil just slightly mentioned there as well, and obviously bearing in mind all this is going to be different depending on the different regional archetypes as well. So what I'm trying to say overall is that this is what we're building is a decision tool through this financial model that has a sort of robust methodology that's all very transparent and can be adapted depending on the region that we're looking at. Next slide, please. Thanks again. So this is just a little bit around just of the structure that Kate referred to. I think from a financial perspective. So you got looped sort of at the top, which is aggregating all the different local development vehicles and getting these sort of the early stage development piece done. It acts as the sort of the governance and the oversight across the whole piece, which obviously is very assuring for investors. And it's the one that owns the digital platform. So its revenues come through from sort of license and service type fees for those services that it's providing. You then got the asset co, which is a sort of typical infrastructure style investment vehicle, sort of ring fenced SPV, which holds the infrastructure for that LDV or can be multiple LDVs. Its income comes from the standing charge, which flows straight to it, which it then uses to pay its operational costs and then service its infrastructure debt. A local development vehicle is effectively a sort of a devco during the delivery and the development piece of it, and then it's like an opco as the system is then operational. So its income is basically sort of service fees coming from the asset co, and obviously over time. As the project scales, those costs reduce significantly on a per home basis. And then lastly, the energy club. This is sort of set up, structured so that it can optimize the electricity generation from the solar and will work on the various sort of flexibility income opportunities and therefore reducing the household bill, but without sort of affecting the sort of the bankability of the standing charge through to the asset co. Thank you. So key insights, I suppose not unexpectedly to hear that this is obviously it's expensive at the moment and without significant upfront subsidy, it's hard to make this kind of work. But what we're seeing as we kind of go through these sort of scaling assumptions, that those costs are reducing down. And meaning it becomes a lot more sort of workable and realistic. Having said that, though, obviously even in some of the scaled scenarios, we still do need grant intervention. So this project is going to be sort of aligned very much to the Warm Homes grant, and we're sort of working and sort of putting our case forward in that regard. So overall, we're still very much sort of work in progress, but with a sort of a good direction that we're kind of going in. But the value of what we're kind of creating here is that we have a very robust financial framework. We've got a very granular level of understanding of all this, which is sort of a live feed that's being built up on from the current pilots and other projects that are starting to commence. So we're getting a really good idea in terms of what the key sort of blockers are around this and what level of support is needed, like where and when. Next slide, thank you. Okay, and then so just last on these next steps. So we're kind of finishing off right now just the sort of current scenario and sensitivity testing using learnings from the various cost reviews that we're sort of finishing up on. We're thinking through obviously how the level of sort of grant funding is going to be needed, and how that sort of is optimized depending on the different archetype of the area. We're now engaging with investors using the model to sort of work through some of the sort of key investment questions and risks. We're using the model to support our case in terms of talking to government around how Net Zero Terrace Street can be embedded into the Warmest Home Plan. We've got some live sort of projects starting to commence and sort of be using the financial model in a real world use case, and sort of seeing how to make sure that is all working properly. And then sort of maybe more of a sort of further afield, we're sort of thinking around not just at the individual LDV level, but how this whole piece can be sort of approached from a portfolio perspective, and then how it can potentially sort of be refinanced as this becomes a sort of new investable asset class. I think that's yeah, okay. I'll hand over to Adam now to do the investment piece.
Thanks so much, Ainsley, and hi to everyone. I'm here to provide a little bit of color on what the market is actually looking like from our perspective at SIB as a social investor. Our focal point recently has been on the development finance hurdle for these types of projects, especially when it comes to that initial set of bundles, as has been discussed, because often in financing terms, it boils down essentially to how much it costs per property, and these upfront development costs are substantial at this scale. And so I think somebody asked who's taking the risk, and we and some other social investors are looking at, especially on the heat side, where you've got a lot of additional upfront costs, finding ways to push development finance into that. But that is a clear challenge in the market. There is quite a bit of construction finance and other types, but that development piece is very clear in an upfront way. That retrofit, Ainsley talked a little bit about embedding it in the Warm Homes plan. And there's also a couple of questions about ownership structure in terms of where the retrofit and the grant comes in. And I think that will be a key point to address as you go into the market and understand how the stack all comes together. One of the points that we find is which community entity is actually handling the grant and delivering on whatever piece of it is. And you see that in the past, that's been one of the challenges for delivering retrofit, is that you've got money, but there's no clear avenue for it to be delivered. And the Terrace Streets plan has that possibility, but getting that structure agreed with the grant makers is key. And so that baked in part of Warm Homes. Pilot demonstrations, as Ainsley noted, the next step is to move to the 200 homes, and those risks are substantial. And so the market that we found is that there is a desire to see financing come through other means, whether or not that be grant or social investment, to even go through a pilot phase. While in commercial terms, that might have not been the requirement, but because there's some risk associated with how the stack comes together, how all those pieces, those first three that Phil talked about at the beginning, that are at risk before you get to the further five, and that it, rather than it being put together in financing terms that we'll see the whole project financed, it may be becoming piecemeal and finding different partners along the way. But the main thing that we've realized is coming through here is that long-term capital exists in the market already. So a lot of what the focus can be on is this challenging startup phase. But once the projects are in a place to be either near construction or in process, there exists 50-year money that should be able to align with the return of the investors and simultaneously providing the value to the consumer and the communities, because 50-year finance is both competitive and seen as a benefit to some infrastructure-based investments, and these types of projects where you have a standing charge and you have a structure which allows for long-term community engagement are seen as very appealing. So from our vantage point, and this is where I'll do a little plug for, if you look up SIB Community Heat, where we're focused on the heat side, that finding these development finance pieces will help the Terrace Streets project get over this initial hurdle and be able to deliver on the long-term value of it. And that's really what the area of focus is going to be. But I will say that from a pure interest point of view, plugging this gap within the government mandate is definitely of clear interest. There's belief that if there's a little bit of private finance that can go in, the government will also add in some grant or some regulatory support in there. And so we're just trying to blend that combination in the right kind of way right now. So, and then we can flip forward. And I think it's Kate now wrapping up.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so I've got a bit longer than when you go first, you feel like you're rushing a bit, so everyone can get their slides in. But yeah, just before I start on this, how are we doing questions, Peter? Are we bringing people in, or are we doing them at the end?
Yeah, so after this, we've got a Q&A. There's lots lined up. Definitely,
Yeah.
people can upvote the ones they want to do, they want to answer, because I don't think we're going to get through all of them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Okay, so just in terms of where we're up to, and I'm trying to think which questions I can answer at the same time. We've had two main tranches of funding. One is the one we're currently on with the Net Zero Living programme, and that's that was the non-technical, I think it was called, funding, how you deploy these solutions, but the non-technical side. And then we've also been working with Electricity North West through the Strategic Innovation Fund, Discovery and Alpha, and now we're on an NIA with them, a Network Innovation Allowance. So across those two projects, we've really built up this big body of work. And what we're doing with the methodology is thinking, how do we share that with communities to help them go through that methodology to replicate how you can deliver Net Zero Terrace Street. But that's always around the kind of these 5 systems. So the key is that we're testing that deployment as well. So the physical infrastructure, we've done the 3 homes, but the next step is really thinking about how we do a 200 home demonstrator. Creating demand, as I mentioned earlier, we want to work, and we're hoping to do some work with Middleton Cooperating and Middleton Mayoral Development Corporation in Rochdale, and thinking about how we can help grow and enable them and bring forward that community agency that's so key to developing these solutions. As I said, the virtual infrastructure, that's working with the NWL on the NIA, and we'll look to do a Strategic Innovation Fund beta with them as well. And we've been testing those kind of organisational structures, and I think there's a question from Saskia in there in terms of how have you determined those. And I think the key there is that we've got a framework, but each locale will be different. So the idea is that we've got that organisational framework, but a local community organisation might want to tweak that in some way. The Asset Co, I think Paul asked who owns the Asset Co. Again, that is to be determined by the locale. So it might be it's a joint venture with the local authority. It might be that the community want to own that Asset Co and raise funding into that Asset Co. It might be a different type of entity. So again, we've got to make sure the structure is there and the framework's there, but it's loose enough to enable the community to make those decisions. But the digital spine, that is all about data, and that's an end-to-end process. Next slide, please. So in terms of that body of knowledge that we have been bringing together, we've mentioned these kind of 8 stages, and underneath each one, each stage is a considerable amount of either tools or templates, etc. And I'm always at pains to say that all these will be iterated as we move forward. This isn't the answer to everything, it's just our starting point. And the more we work with local communities and organisations, we want to create that kind of learning feedback loop to make sure that we're always iterating, but we're collecting new information and making sure that that is uniform across groups that want to work towards this solution. Next slide, please. So just an example of some of the tools we've been building in terms of the methodology. And these are all been mostly done, these ones, through the Net Zero Living programme. And, you know, we're happy to kind of work with others to develop their own bespoke or tweaked, for example. Next slide, please. And also how the local authorities work. So we've obviously been partnering with Rossendale Borough Council, and Natalie's been working really hard along with Ailsa at CAG, looking at how the local authority can basically do this in terms of planning, finance, highways. And also we've been working with the National Wealth Fund as well in terms of how they can potentially support local authorities to develop this in terms of financing as well. Next slide, please. And also, as part of the Net Zero Living project, we've set up Looped Energy Communities, which is a community interest company. There's a joint venture with Rossendale Valley Energy and Centre for Energy Equality. And really, that's the kind of hub where we will collate all this collateral and where we're developing the smart local energy system. And essentially, that entity will be the entity that will support and the local development organisation. So essentially, Rossendale Valley Energy is a local development organisation. We want to develop affordable energy and healthy warm homes for the communities in Rossendale, but through Looped, we want Looped to be able to support other communities to deliver as well. Next slide, please. Oh, great, we're onto the Q&A, which, as you say, Peter, there's quite a few there. So
yes,
over to you. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks everyone. There's a huge wealth of detail coming across, and that's definitely reflected in the questions.
Sorry, Peter. Sorry, just before you go with Q&A, I realised that my last slide was missing now, which is the where next. So just very, very briefly, as I say, we're on the NIA, which is Network Innovation Allowance. We're going to be moving towards an application for Strategic Innovation Fund Beta, but that's really focused on network and the smart systems. We have been successful in the Net Zero Living closed competition, which enables us to carry on this work to the end of March. And we're working in 3 clusters, one in Rossendale, one in Rochdale, and one in Bridgend, where we're going to go through our 8-stage methodology to stage 3/4 on the ground to the end of March, and then mapping out what stage 4 to 8 will look like. And that will really give us a financial model for a 200 home cluster. We'll have done some energy audits, we'll have built the building energy model, the techno-economic model. We'll have done work with the local community anchor organisations and mapped the skill sets in that area, looked at the supply chain in that area, worked with the local authority to get an understanding of what their appetite is in terms of asset co, etc. And then really kind of mapping out, well, how do we deploy? What's the next 18 months from March in terms of how much it's going to cost? What's the blended finance stack need to be? And how do we actually deliver? And then finally, we're also working with West Yorkshire Combined Authority and Leeds City Council to look at some terrace homes in Armley as well. So lots to continue on now, but still post-March, we're looking at how we can actually deploy 200 homes in clusters. Sorry, thanks, Peter.
No worries. Thank you for covering off that. So we've got over 20 questions and about 10 minutes left. So I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but hopefully we can get through plenty. The first one is with the most upvotes is how I'm choosing them, from Karen Spenley, saying that ambient loops and geothermal are underutilized in the UK. What are the main challenges? Well, why is that? If that is the case, I don't know. Perhaps I don't know if that's one for you, Phil, or Kate.
I mean, I'm happy to start off with that. Yeah, I think generally speaking, the transition to low carbon heat has been a lot slower than certainly against government targets, air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. So looking at ground source heat pumps in isolation's perhaps not quite the way to look at it, but it's why a heat pump's struggling. Part of that, of course, is understanding the technology and the change to that. Part of it's understanding the cost associated with it. And whilst things are improving in the air source heat pump domain, the ground source heat pump supply chain is being more limited. And I think we're also recognising this hurdle that we've been really looking at in Net Zero Terrace Streets, which is you have to do quite a bit of work to make the system to work. So it's an infrastructure item as opposed to an individual house by house item as well. So that requires a coordinated effort by supply chain to deliver it. And it's just, in simple terms, not as mature in terms of supply chain as other areas. But, as we've been looking at, it's got huge potential. And the other thing from a Brahapple perspective as well is that it doesn't come up in local area energy planning and other related initiatives. Local energy planning typically looks at large commercial heat networks or air source heat pumps as deployment options, and ambient loops rarely figure in that. It's something we're looking to change in the way that we plan, but I think there's a lot to do there in terms of the sector to raise the profile of the potential of these systems and look at areas where commercial heat networks aren't going to be deployed, but where air source heat pumps aren't the natural solution either, and where's the gap, and this type of solution would fit that gap.
And just to add to that, Peter, I think one of the things that is missed here is that community organisation. So if you see where these solutions are happening, it's new build and social housing, because the community organisation is already done for you. In social housing, you've got the landlord. In new build, you've not got anyone to have to talk to anyway. We took a lot of inspiration from Broadband for Rural North, which is broadband rollout into rural areas, where the big boys weren't going to go because it wasn't going to be, enough cost benefit. And it's a community benefit society. And essentially they go to communities, or communities come to them and say, we'd like you to come and work with us. And they say, okay, well, you go and speak to parish council and get 15 members on board, and then we'll come and work with you. So they do ask you to pump prime in some way your community organisation and engagement. And that just kind of rolls into a point that I think Michael Bevan's made in terms of share capital. Broadband for Rural North is a community benefit society, and they raise money through share issue to pay for that community infrastructure of broadband. The difference here is it's just too expensive, to do shared ground loops. The cost would be too much to raise in a community share offer. We would love to be able to have a share of the asset code that's raised by community share offer. And it could be that the asset co is owned by the community in some way. But I think we've got to be pragmatic about delivery and how much can we feasibly raise through share issues. But I think for us in the community energy sector, that community organisation, which goes back to the slide that actually filled it ages ago, the messy one of individuals and the community cohesive, brought together. That's what we're doing at that local development organisation. We are doing that community organising, and that's what we want other community groups to do, is that community organising and interfacing. So because other people aren't going to do that for us, essentially.
Yeah. Nicely brought on to the next question. I don't know if Ainsley or Adam wanted to chip in on that, looking at community ownership as part of the funding model, or whether Kate's go for it.
I think Kate's probably covered like the key gist of it really there, but yeah, definitely looking at it. It's just a question of throughout the capital stack, how that can sort of fit in. With the sort of it's some large numbers that we're going to be looking at. So how that fits in was still on the question.
So the next question is
just to add to that, Peter, sorry, I think that's why, going back to that diagram, why the energy co-op is so important, because it gives that democratic oversight. So the energy cooperative, where you join, if you connected to the infrastructure, you have a golden share in that asset co. So you have democratic oversight over the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and then you also have oversight over the smart energy system. So this is about people in those homes not having a Thames water, essentially having the infrastructure flogged on and people standing charge go up. So it's got to have that democratic oversight and that power and control. So it might not have the community ownership. We'd love it to have community ownership, but we've got to make sure that we've embedded that community oversight and agency within the model.
A quick bounce on from that to you, Adam. Does that have an impact on attracting finance, particularly as it's growing? Is that a risk to investors?
It certainly is a risk. That you would have seen in, I forget whose slide, a note of a golden share in there, which is a structure that we've explored in that it reserves certain rights to the community, but doesn't affect the overall bankability of the project. And I think that's just one amongst the several different types that will have to be in discussion throughout the entirety, because As noted, the capital requirements are far beyond what a community is normally capable of raising, and also the regulatory responsibilities for providing heat, for instance, are also demanding. So finding a JV structure or a golden share or a way to enter in where there are carve-outs, I think will be the most appealing for both communities and the market, and that you can separate out what are the key points. I think there's a question about finance source of the household bills and how you manage those, and then the long-term investor requirements for taking on the risk.
Thanks, Alan. So next one from Lee Barker, looking at kind of what level of fabric is justified. And I guess the other context of this is if the spark gap, the cost ratio of gas and electricity price changes, does that change the rationale for how much fabric? How have we approached this?
So essentially, we're bringing the heat load of the house down to meet the heat pump requirement. So it's whatever it takes to do that. So I don't know whether we mentioned, I think there was a question. So we're doing properties in Rossendale, which is sandstone, with really high U value. So yeah, so it's hopefully when we look at Rochdale, it might be less hard to bring the heat load of the house down.
So it's the physical size of a unit that makes sense, that's sizing it, rather than the economics. And the
exactly the static part of that equation is the borehole and the heat pump.
Yeah.
Or the heat pump anyway, at least, and then we adjust the fabric accordingly.
Grand. So there's a question from Paul Fair about the asset company and the kind of early stage risk. Don't know if that's one for you, Ainsley.
Pass on to Kate, back to Kate. We're still thinking through some of those things.
So yeah, at the early stages, it depends at which stage of the methodology, because obviously we've got warranties on the work that's done in the home, and the asset co will have liability over the in-street infrastructure. So it's kind of separated out. It's not kind of wrapped in one. I don't know whether that answers your question, Paul, but I'd say that the risk is split across different activities and they are picked off accordingly.
Okay, there's going to be one more question. Before that, I'm just going to say that Joseph will be putting something out as a bit of a feedback poll. So expect that coming to you in a moment. But the last question from Rob Barthorpe is looking at flexibility and whether the thermal or electrical storage or even longer duration storage might kind of impact the overall view either now or for future projects.
So yeah, so flexibility is something we're picking up in the smart local energy system that we're doing with Electricity Northwest. So it's about aggregating the data across each home to look at what across that aggregation, how we can ramp up or ramp down heat pumps, for example, how we can use storage, how we can use solar generation, how we can optimize and balance across that aggregation of homes, how we can sell on potential flexibility and return that to the consumers via the Energy Club. So this is all about people, again, having ring fencing that future benefits of flexibility revenue rather than letting that be extracted by Big Six, for example. So there's very much, but it again, it's how you socialize that benefit as well. And what we want to do is not make sure that some people in some areas where there's lots of constraint on the network have more revenue from another area that doesn't have constraints, for example. So there's a big piece going on with Electricity Northwest on that. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and that's certainly a wider question that's we at Regen and the whole industry is looking at exploring how this local and national flex kind of comes together. We're out of time. Apologies to all those who've asked questions in the Q&A and haven't heard an answer. There will be future webinars, and you can find more information about the Net Zero Terrace Streets and Community Energy England and their work on this if you look online. Thank you very much for coming, and great thanks to all our panelists. What a packed hour. So thanks very much and enjoy your afternoon.